Okay, so it seems like everything is recording, so that's all good. Sorry about the um, sorry about the presentation here. It's very murky outside, but the topic of my video is uh, Anitube cannot become an academic space. And the people who are working in Anitube should not, and I don't really think cannot be considered academics, at least in the context of academics as a result of Anitube as an academic space, because it's not. When we talk about academia, there's usually a few constants. It's still kind of debated as to exactly what precisely it is, but it's roughly the things that are in relation to the academy. And there's a few things that come with that. One of the things that come along with that are journal and publications, which I'm willing to say that let's put that aside and believe that videos and whatever that comes out on Anitube can be considered journals and publications. Now, they are not peer-reviewed, which kind of makes it a little difficult to consider them on the same level, but let's go with that. But there are also some other issues, like we have academic analysis has to move beyond descriptive analysis, which is this is what's happening, this is how it goes, and we can kind of say there's a little bit of that. While I disagree with the idea that there has to be a prescriptivist notion to storytelling, I guess you can consider it as sort of that kind of thing, but it's a rather loose formulation. But the third one, I would say, is the conferences. So the conferences are supposed to be this sort of space where new ideas are put forward, they're challenged, and oftentimes they're either discarded or they're more often changed and modified and improved upon until we finally come to something that is a little bit more polished. Those are the intentions of the conference. We don't have that. Anitube doesn't have that. There is no sense of anything that is matching the conference or the conference system, which is actually part of the lifeblood of academia. The ability to go to a place or convene at a place and say, these are some of the ideas I'm working with, these are some of the implications of these ideas. What do you think? And other people will essentially come and they will say, yeah, sure, go with it. Or, have you considered this, this, and this? Or this person has already talked about this. Why is yours different? There are a few things that Anitube has in terms of its operational quirks, I would say, that sort of make me a little bit uneasy about its role as academia or any type of thing reaching academia. And that is this one. When we're talking about ideas and idea exchanges, people don't really exchange ideas with each other. There are people in small groups that sort of exchange ideas within those groups, but they don't necessarily exchange ideas overall. Now, of course, to be fair, academia kind of operates like that as well. There are groups and journal groups and people sort of globbing together in particular cliques or schools or sort of modes of thought, and sometimes there is a little bit of sometimes there is some isolation, or I guess you can say maybe some gatekeeping, but it's not as trenchant as we might see in Anitube. The other problem is that the theory threshold in this community is actually incredibly low. When people talk about subjective and subjectivity, the idea of being subjective is largely, and this is a concern that I've raised as well, it's largely in this sort of mix between Cartesian, Kantian sense, and anything that sort of is outside of that sort of falls into things that are not really considered to be subjective. Sometimes if you're trying to apply a subjective model, people end up thinking, well, this is not something that this is not something that the show is doing. Or people might say, well, they fall back on the subjective Kantian defense, which is, like, this is how I feel about the object. And I know a few of you might say, well, that's not necessarily Kantian, but I'm not really coming up with a better term to describe it. And if anybody has a better term to describe it, please let me know in the comment section. People don't really understand how models work. When you're applying a particular model upon a piece of work, and people say, well, that's not applicable, that's overthinking. A model is not something that you can say that the work is trying to be this model. A model is a way of framing and understanding the nodal connections of a piece of work in a particular way and what sort of implication it has on it. It's sort of like a meta-narrative, a Leotardian meta-narrative, in that things don't come out to talk about the meta-narrative. The meta-narrative simply accounts for a way in which we might think about how something arises. And so people don't really seem to understand how models and modeling works, and that sort of is another thing that we also have to consider. Another one is this idea that the practices aren't there. People don't cite. People don't give clear acknowledgement or description of the lineages in which a lot of these ideas are coming about. Like, if you're going to say, like, this, and this, well, where did you get this information from? Whose work are you building upon? Because if you're going to just flat out say that this comes out like this, then I'm going to assume that what you've stated is, unless it's common knowledge, which is very, very important because the threshold for common knowledge is very different in this community. Unless it's common knowledge, I'm going to assume that what you're proposing is new information. And so, if it's new information, I'm going to wonder how you've come to that conclusion. And a lot of times that's very opaque, and that can be a problem. Academia still kind of has this problem as well. Oftentimes people will give descriptions of what's happening, but they don't really cite it, and that can be challenging. But it's not as bad as it is in Anitube. The last one is also a problem in academia, but I think it's a really big problem in Anitube, and that is because it's on a platform that is fundamentally a private organization, it's beholden to capitalism. So I'm going to be taking a page out of Adorno and Horkheimer's Culture Industry, in which they roughly talk about the way in which culture is beholden to sort of quasi-materialistic forces as a result of capitalism, how capitalism has a tendency to force culture to shape and create things and artifacts in specific ways, and it sort of makes it look like that we have choices and ideas that can flow freely and all that kind of stuff. But oftentimes, perhaps, if you're going to go as far as Adorno and Horkheimer, most of the times that's not the case. And I think that's kind of the trouble that we have to factor in here as well in terms of Anitube. Because one of the things about academia is that a lot of the ideas might not be tenable, but it's on some level somewhat sustainable because of the way in which public and private funding goes into academia. But there is no public funding. There is no accounting for the private funding there is no accounting for private funding that happens in Anitube. To fund something, you have to be sponsored by something, or at least to fund something sufficiently, you have to be sponsored by something, or you have to have a Patreon. And so there's a particular force that affects your ability to create content in a way. There are a few people that might somewhat be inoculated to this. People, I would say, as weird as it is, I would say probably Digi is kind of inoculated to this in a few ways, because he's not selling a particular set of schools of ideas, but rather he's selling himself as he behaves in this larger morass of I wouldn't say content. Like, I'm talking about anime. I'm not making a judgment on his content creation. But like, he's a little bit bulwarked in this, in that he can kind of talk about what he wants to talk about, because what he's selling is him as a personality, but that's not tenable for everyone. And the material he puts out fundamentally falls back to the issue of modeling that I said back, that, ultimately, by selling yourself as the sort of endpoint in which ideas come out, you fall back into the individual person as the fundamental subjective node, as the fundamental subjective nexus, if you want to say. And so alternative models can be a little bit challenging. If people are coming in and they want to see what you think about something, well, how do you account for you within a larger model beyond that? How do you talk about the historical materialist relationship if you are supposedly the only person that sort of matters in this analytical process? But I've sort of taken up too much of your time, everybody. Those are my main things. I don't think that we have to strive towards Anitube as an academic space. I really don't think it can be an academic space. I think academics can operate on it. I think they can do things on it. But there are far too many challenges associated with YouTube and Anitube specifically that make it really untenable for any real academic material to be coming out. And that's not a bad thing, necessarily. That's not a bad thing. But I don't think people should be trying to sell themselves as academic. Having fancy ideas and fancy words doesn't make you a part of the academy, which is something that I've always been stressing. And I don't really consider myself as part of the academy, so that's kind of the thing. That's kind of the challenge. But yeah, I hope you guys enjoy your day. Peace.